Well, I grew up inside the Pentagon. My parents were civilian employees at the Pentagon, as was my aunt who lived with us. And as I grew up, I was often taken by my parents into the Pentagon for the day, for a work day. And as I got older, I always had an interest in reading from when I was very young, and so I would often be dropped off at the Pentagon Library. My father was in charge of the loading docks, and so he took me down into the lower floors of the building. There's actually more floors beneath. Well, I grew up inside the Pentagon. My parents were civilian employees at the Pentagon, as was my aunt who lived with us. And as I grew up, I was often taken by my parents into the Pentagon for the day, for a work day. And as I got older, I always had an interest in reading from when I was very young, and so I would often be dropped off at the Pentagon Library. My father was in charge of the loading docks, and so he took me down into the lower floors of the building. There's actually more floors beneath the ground than there are above. And he showed me where storage areas were. He showed me a very large room where they took paper that they had already used, or that was classified or declassified or whatever, shredded it, pulped it, and made it into notebooks and paper for the building's use. So they had like this was in the 1950s, they had a recycling plant for paper inside the Pentagon.
So in that respect, they were progressive.
Yeah, in that sense. Just that I read later that the National Security Agency, in Bamford's first book, Puzzle Palace, he notes that they declassify so much paper every day that in the winter they burn it in order to heat the building. So some part of the paper use gets recycled in these systems. and often the Pentagon is at the cutting edge, as intelligence is, of the technologies, because they're looking for the new technologies so that they can use them for warfare and for advantage. William S. Burroughs has a great quote. He says, if this was the Middle Ages and Magellan was an American and he sailed around the planet and found out it was round instead of flat, that we wouldn't tell anyone so we could attack from the rear. And I think that's the mentality, is that they get out there and try to find the new technologies and then hide them from us. But I'm familiar with the building. I grew up in it and outside of it and around it, and it's changed somewhat over the years, but in terms of how much security, it used to be a much more public and open building and have open public areas and bus routes and everything, and now over the last, I'd say, 20 years even, from the 80s on, it's become a more secured building. The first security was to keep the homeless out of the public areas who were coming in to sleep. But, that's built up now to, in the mid-90s, I organized a day without the Pentagon and helped organize it, but I was one of the key people. And it was the first Pentagon demonstration there in, I guess, 25 years, something. But people had been going to the White House, but nobody going over to the Pentagon. So we marched from the National Cemetery to the Pentagon. And I had to have these meetings because D.C. itself is a multi-jurisdictional district. It's a military district, it's a federal district, it's a local D.C. district, it's a park district. There's separate cops for all these. There's also separate cops for the metro, separate cops for any part of Arlington, separate cops for individual buildings, and separate cops for the Pentagon itself, which is a military reservation. So when you go to negotiate a demonstration from the National Cemetery to the Pentagon, that little stretch of under a mile, you have to talk to 16 different departments in order to negotiate. So there were 2 of us and about 20 of them. And they told us from the Pentagon security end that this is mid-90s, that they were under a Delta security threat, and therefore we couldn't get up to the actual steps of the Pentagon. And they put a security line between this parade area that they have outside where the Joint Chiefs are and us, so that we couldn't get past it up to the steps of the Pentagon, even though there's been Supreme Court decisions that you can go right up to the steps. They weren't allowing it because of this threat, and they claimed that they had the threat on because they were getting almost daily bomb threat calls from Muslims. and they asked us if Muslims were going to be part of our demonstration. We said, yes, there are progressive, peaceful Muslims that we work with, you know, in the community here in D.C., and they're going to accompany us. But there's any reason that you know, should be singling them out. But what I'm telling you is that here's a building on alert 5 years before, to the point that regular people aren't allowed near it, and yet on that day, the building is successfully attacked without any defense being put up. I was also told by the main security guy who took me on a little tour, actually, of the Joint Chief area, where I had never been. My mother had never even taken me in there. She showed me the dining room where they eat and took me through that section. And it was right across from where, you know, we were going to be demonstrating. So there was a question about our sound system disturbing their work that day, and there were other things. But we had a successful demonstration, and actually it was a slow news day. Monica Lewinsky was finally dropping out of the news, and C-SPAN covered the whole thing, all 6 hours, all of our speakers, and even turned the cameras around and covered the civil disobedience, which consisted mostly of young kids going up and trying to throw themselves across the flower bed and get past the police line and being grabbed and thrown back by the Pentagon security guards. But it was an interesting demonstration. But he took me around and took me outside and said that the demonstration would be filmed, and that they had cameras and also radar detectors that were looking at the air over the Pentagon all the time. And so what I'm telling you is that they have an elaborate security system in place, and had it in place, you know, from when I was young, because in the 1950s, I used to go with my parents for lunch during, you know, when they'd have their lunch break, out into the central courtyard and eat lunch. And my parents, I remember my dad showing me surface-to-air missile ports in those areas in the 1950s, you know, that were for the protection of the building. I mean, I didn't understand all they were, but I understood that they were ports where missiles came out of and, you know, could go up in the air. So this is, you know, this is 40, 45 years ago, okay? You just have to figure, I mean, if this is a center of defense for the United States, it must have a way to defend itself, or you'd think it would, especially with the kind of money that we've given it. Well, I'm close enough to the Pentagon physically. I'm in Anacostia, right across the river, that I felt the actual blast. It shook the windows of my house. I also was awakened that morning by a call when the first Twin Tower was hit by someone that I know, one of the researchers in D.C. that works on the Kennedy assassination stuff. And he was concerned because he's in Air Traffic Authority in Virginia around Dulles area and sits on some boards that make those decisions. And he called and he said right away that there's something seriously wrong, because there's no way a commercial airliner should be anywhere near these buildings, that it's a restricted space, even up in New York, where, of course, just for common safety reasons, you don't bring planes. So he knew something was wrong, and in the course of telling me that he thought something was wrong, the second plane hit. And then he said, my God, the balloon is up, because he and the rest of the country immediately knew that this was not an accident. I mean, coincidence theory goes out the window. This is using planes as weapons. And this is not unknown to the intelligence communities. If you remember, a plane, small plane, Piper plane, but flew into the White House at one point during the Clinton years. And that was a very strange incident, but in response, they built a surface-to-air missile port on the front lawn of the White House and put some bushes around it. And it was mentioned in the Post and at the time, and it's visible there out on the lawn. And so the White House added defense to itself. And this plane on September 11th flew over the White House and over the Capitol, looped around, and then went on this 270-degree turn to hit the one side of the Pentagon that had nobody in it almost. This area they'd been reconstructing for 3 years, and most of the offices were still empty. And it had to go out of its way, literally, I mean, in order to hit that side. I mean, it wasn't that the other sides were blocked access. It was a choice what side they came in on. And it minimized the number of deaths inside the Pentagon and overall to go in on that side. There were more people killed in the plane and in the work crews outside than were killed inside the Pentagon by the blast. But it was close to home, and then I went downstairs and turned on combination of local news, Channel 8 and CNN and whatever national news stuff I could get, and I was flipping around just trying to see what they were reporting. And it was reported on local news and somewhat on national, but very clearly on local news that a third plane had turned around in Ohio and was heading back toward Washington, D.C. And it was announced that it was coming to D.C. publicly. I mean, this wasn't some kind of state secret. Everyone in D.C. that had a TV or a radio on knew that a plane was coming to D.C. And the authorities certainly knew. It wasn't off their radar screen. And this was about a half an hour before it hit that I heard, you know, on the local news that this plane was headed to D.C. And absolutely nothing was done to interfere with this plane. There were some jets scrambled out of Langley, which is a base 130 miles from D.C. Too late to even get to the Pentagon before it was hit. Or at least too late, you know, that I think if the planes flew at the full speed, they could have gotten there, but I don't think they did. You know, because even 130 miles, I mean, these planes go like 550, 600, you know, maybe even 700 miles an hour. So if they're up by 9:25, can they get there by 9:48? You know, maybe 130 miles. It doesn't seem, but in fact, they came in 5 minutes after the incident. So it seems to me maybe they weren't even going full speed once they got up. But there are planes, interceptor planes right across the river at Anacostia Naval Air Station, at Andrews Air Force Base. These were not put into the sky. And I have seen these planes as a child in D.C., and my relatives have seen them come up and guard that restricted airspace, which is the most restricted airspace in the country, from commercial airliners or private planes that have gone off course and strayed into that space, are intercepted and wagged out of that space. So that's not even in some kind of a crisis or national emergency or plane being used as weapon or what was happening September 11th. Just in normal course of events, helicopters, interceptors, things go up in that space because it's guarded space. And they have the capacity, both at the White House and at the Pentagon, to use the surface-to-air missiles, you know, and they also had a formal shoot-down order from Cheney and Bush, according to the press accounts from inside, moments after the second plane hit. Bush and Cheney, you know, spoke and announced that there was a shoot-down order on the remaining planes that were
Did that go out
hijacked.
over the media?
It didn't go out over the media, but it would have gone out to the military authorities that needed to know it.
Right. So I guess, is there documentation on that?
There is afterward documentation in the media that it happened, yes. Yeah, I mean, I've got just regular public media reports about it, and but they started claiming later that there was no mechanism or they didn't have the right kind of planes at Andrews and yada yada, and I mean, it's all smoke. It's not right. I mean, they have them and they didn't use them, and so regardless of who the sponsor is behind the event, there also was somebody within the chain of command here that made a conscious decision to stand down that day and let that attack happen. And the fact that the attack went out of its way to hit the empty side of the Pentagon tells me that something else is wrong. But D.C. began to go into martial law. They had continuity of government, which means that government's taken away from all but a few members of Congress and put into the hands of people at the top of the National Security Council and the White House. FEMA, Defense Department, and National Security Agency, DIA, and those agencies still are running the country to a great extent more than any democratic process that was in place prior to it. I mean, they already had great influence, but now they openly control us. So for instance, when the business people started complaining that Reagan National Airport was shut down for too long and they were losing too much money, they had to go and make that complaint to the National Security Agency and the National Security Council and the FEMA and DOD. They didn't, you know, it wasn't a local decision that was going to be made. So DC's already federalized, it's a colony, but I mean, now the whole country is federalized in a way that a lot of people don't understand. Because when you declare a formal national emergency, a lot of legal authorities shift over. and decisions are made at other levels, and there are federal regions, and so all sorts of things have shifted in terms of legal niceties and priorities and who's in charge of what once you're in this kind of a declared emergency. It's not yet a declared war. Some more powers were approved, but that's similar to Vietnam. It was not a declared war. Plus, who are we at war with? I mean, you know, we outside of, as I call him, Dr. Osama bin Laden in his magical cave that James Bond can't penetrate, you know, I mean, who is it that we're fighting? And it's sort of enemy of the hour. You know, we'll get the list tomorrow of what the next 4 countries we want to go into and bother. So, you know, and all of it's done in secrecy, and we're being told that it has to remain in secret. The evidence is secret. The processes of response are secret. You know, but trust us, we're taking care of you. Well, I mean, we've trusted them to the tune of $13 trillion since the end of World War II. Have they taken care of us? Or have they provided basically what in the old mafia term is a protection racket, where they send a guy around to break your window and they send another guy around to make sure it doesn't happen again for a certain fee. And, you know, the fee is 25% of our hard-earned tax dollars going into this monstrous military machinery, and less of it coming back to us. I mean, it's to the point now, I mean, the ludicrousness of it, after all that debate about the Social Security locked box and everything else, now we're being told that the only way they can pay for the tax rebate they gave back, given the deficit that they've created and the military budget that they want and the intelligence budget that they want, is that they're going to have to take it out of Social Security. So our tax rebate is now coming out of our Social Security funds. And, you know, similarly, all the priorities now are on defense and intelligence spending and not on social needs. And it's going to be considered irresponsible for Congress people to go the other way. One of the top lobbyists for Boeing said the cookie jar is open, and if any of you vote against defense appropriations, you won't be here next time around. So they have their, you know, their rationale in place for what they've wanted to do for a long time anyway. I mean, these things that we're seeing were not created whole cloth after September 11. The so-called Patriot Act that shifted over all these authorities and undermined constitutional rights and other things was like 300 pages, and it was introduced, you know, within days after the attack. So, I mean, they didn't write 300 pages of law in 4 or 5 days. They had it sitting on a shelf waiting for its excuse. And I've actually been following these people in my research, Rand Corporation and back into the 60s, and other big corporations that have been planning this sort of emergency response, emergency preparedness, emergency readiness. And this is really the most hierarchical and most autocratic elements within the government, the most arrogant in terms of, you know, we know what's good for you, and you don't need your rights in order to be, you know, protected. In fact, you better give up your rights if you want to protect your rights. And so it's that kind of logic, but I mean it comes out of, well, for instance, the Watergate burglars. Many of them were top-ranking intelligence guys that go back to the Bay of Pigs and other covert operations. But McCord, who really pulled the plug on the operation and created the arrest situation and blew the whistle on it, was long-term CIA, but he was also in the Office of Emergency Preparedness in the White House, which was a secret emergency planning operation. He would have been in charge in a declared emergency of all U.S. mail and media. So someone has that position right now who, you know, in this emergency is in charge of the media and what it's allowed to say, and in charge of the mail and how it's being processed. And I mean, of course, the anthrax was a good excuse to hold up all the mail, and the mail can be routed around for cleaning, you know, and you know. But these are our most basic democratic machinery of mail, communication, internet has now been taken over with Escalon, transportation, you know, around the country, just getting where we need to go, and the broader sort of freedom to communicate, travel, and interchange with each other is compromised in this situation. It was a 16-person committee in the White House those days when McCord was on it. So there are all kind of authorities that change over. Like ultimately the Defense Department runs the phone companies and the phone systems in the United States when they kick it in. Defense Department's in charge of all interstate highway systems and can close them off to civilian use. So when I was sitting there in DC, what I was seeing was a shift over into the continuity of government that's part of emergency planning. Because I've been watching, you know, these plans develop in government studies and things over the years, and the terrorist scenarios, and they have 3 stages of the scenario, from a conventional bomb attack of some kind to a chemical or biological attack, and then to a nuclear attack. And as they go up each stage in the planning, they get closer and closer to full martial law. I did a talk about '96 in Los Angeles called "Are You Scared Yet?" And it was about terrorism and counterterrorism, phony terrorism as I called it, because there were constant incidents under this strategy of tension of terrorism where the group never was heard of before, it was never heard of again, it took credit for it. Often it came out that the group had been connected with or trained by or armed by the CIA. Then the CIA would say, oh, we never knew they'd do anything like this. Then the incident would disappear, and then there'd be another one in a new group, and it had a CIA tie. And so I got to the point where I said, well, it's a good thing there's no real terrorists, because these incidents were staged one after another. And that came up the day the plane went into the White House. Because I got up in the morning and they said a plane has flown into the White House, unknown origin of the plane, unknown pilot, pilot's dead, you know, but you don't have to worry because President Clinton isn't in the White House. They were doing renovations and he's over at the Blair House. Well, not only is the Blair House the place where Truman was attacked by the Puerto Ricans in an earlier incident, but I mean, here it is. I mean, if you really had terrorists, you don't know who this guy is, you don't know if he has accomplices, and you're going to announce, hey, you missed him, he's over at the Blair House? That's what I say. It's a good thing there's no real terrorists. Then later on, they were trying to explain the incident, and how did this plane come into the White House and nobody saw it? And they said, oh, well, he flew down from Baltimore. He took a plane. They said that this is a guy that was living, he'd been disappeared for a couple of weeks. He had been living on 100% disability at a VA psychiatric facility. His son said that, you know, afterwards, his son said, oh, my dad has keys to lots of planes. A guy that lives on 100% psychiatric disability at the VA has keys to lots of planes? What does that mean? And then he goes down and he takes a plane that's not his and he flies out of this little airport in Baltimore down to D.C. Well, what, the plane goes up and the guy in the tower there at the little airport says, there goes another one, Harry, who do you think's in it? There's no alert. You know, the stolen plane. He comes down, and then they said, well, he was flying below tree level across the mall, so we couldn't see him on the radar. Because they first said they didn't see him on the radar, and they said they couldn't see him on the radar. Well, that was right when they were trying to get, I think the guy's name was Duval, out of Haiti. That had taken over in Haiti from Aristide, and they wanted to put, in those days, wanted to put Aristide in. Now they don't like him. But I said, oh, well, there's the perfect plan. I said, you get 100 vets off the psych wards in the VA. You give them Piper Cubs, and they fly into Haiti below tree level, and nobody can see them, and they attack the palace. It's a perfect plan. I mean, of course you can see a plane below tree level. I mean, maybe a mountain would get in the way, but I mean, a plane has got to come down into the tree level first. He didn't fly below tree level all the way from Baltimore. But I mean, radar wouldn't be any use if you couldn't see, you know, at least some things coming at you with other objects in the way. You can still see something moving. So I mean, that was an absurd story. Then they said they didn't see him. Then they said, oh, they'd gone over the tapes and he was, in fact, on the radar. Now, this is the same radar, I mean, you know, that obviously was operating on September 11th, you know. And then finally, their final story was that he was on the radar tapes. The plane was picked up all the way through, but it was between 3 and 4 in the morning, and they don't look at the radar screen those hours. I said, again, it's a good thing there's no real terrorists, because you've just told them you don't look at anything between 3 and 4 in the morning. And you have other duties, if you're going to believe this nonsense, you know. I mean, obviously to me, they let the plane come in, and they let it hit the White House as a message to Clinton, you know. And then the kicker for me was that midway through the day, they said the Clintons knew about the incident, but they weren't going to change their plans, and they were going to go out that evening as planned to the Ford Theater, where Lincoln had been assassinated, to the Ford Theater. So who picked that day on the calendar? You know, the day they stayed at the Blair House and went to the Ford Theater, the plane goes into the front. So I think these terrorist incidents, in the same way that they are in Europe, are planned in conjunction with at least a segment of this internal security state, military industrial, military intelligence and DIA, I think, have a lot to do with it. And then they get the benefits of the fear and the social consequences that come out of them. And they may be things that are coming independently anyway that they find out about and they don't interfere with. Because they knew, for instance, in the first Twin Tower bombing, an FBI unit came across these guys making the plans, and they had an inside informant that was telling them about where they were mixing the bomb and setting it all up. And the FBI told them not to interfere and to let the thing happen, basically. And there are elements that interfere with real investigations when they do come across these things. Like there's a FBI agent, O'Neill, who quit the FBI over the study of the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda. And he said that basically the CIA and the administration were blocking the FBI inquiry into the terrorist cells there on behalf of the oil companies, who didn't want them messing with them because they had their arrangements. And so it can be that they find something that's going and they let it go, or they help it along. Like there's instances in COINTELPRO where the FBI, they come and the group's not doing anything illegal. They have the provocateur tell them to do something illegal. The group says, we don't have any skill in that area. We don't know how to break into a building. The guy says, oh, I've got lockpicks. I've got bombs. I've got, they provide everything, and entrap the people into a plan, that then they can arrest them for. So maybe they help them along, or maybe they just stand out of the way. But at least in D.C., when we had 40 minutes to respond, at least, to sit there and not put up any kind of a defense and not use the local defenses that the buildings themselves have against this plane that everyone knew was a weapon at that point. There's no rational explanation for that in my view, except it was a military stand down in the same way that on November 22nd, Maximilian Reich at Sam Houston was going to bring military units in from military intelligence there as backup to the Secret Service visit in Dallas, was told to stand down. He was ordered to stand down and not bring the units in. Police units that normally would have guarded and overseen Martin Luther King were called off prior to the assassination. I talked to Strategic Air Command bomber pilots who were in the air the hour of the Kennedy assassination, got news of the assassination, figured that there would be a national response to some kind of emergency, maybe even a nuclear war. Went to get their code books in the plane, that they're decoding books that give them the messages from the president, from command and control centers, secured locations, that can go all the way up to failsafe, which means you go beyond a point you can't return and you deliver the bombs. There weren't any code books aboard. And when they landed and talked to the other pilots on that shift, they didn't have code books on their planes, November 22nd, 63. That's the defense of the United States compromised.